Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Matt Gandel, President and CEO of Education Strategy Group, a mission-focused organization that helps institutions, states, and systems advance strategies for increasing educational attainment and expanding economic opportunity and mobility. On behalf of ESG and our partners at the National Skills Coalition, and with the support of the Lumina Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of what will be a series of seminars and webinars on quality credentials to economic recovery. With the unfortunate but continued surge of COVID-19 across our country and across our communities, and the unprecedented impact it's had on the economy, the stakes have never been higher for us in education systems, particularly post-secondary education and workforce systems, to build paths to economic opportunity for those that have been that have lost their jobs or need to upskill to get back into the new economy. There are millions that have filed jobless claims. Those numbers keep going up. Many displaced workers have signaled their interest in coming back and earning new credentials to get to gainful employment and to maneuver back into jobs that are growing and exist. And as leaders, we all know that we must ensure that the time and resources that they spend on improving and upgrading their skills lead to credentials that really land them good jobs. But our labor markets have shifted and are shifting dramatically as we speak. There's so much change and uncertainty that we have to learn which sectors are thriving, which are stable, which continue to decline. We have to be able to look around the corner and determine which credentials will hold value and which won't as time goes on. To make those determinations, NSC and ESG believe that we need more targeted analyses and alignment strategies, and that we need to do this with greater frequency and urgency than we've undertaken before. And that is the reason that we have worked together to put these seminars and webinars on, and we will be doing more and more over the course of the year to try to help states, communities, and institutions build their capacity and better prepare themselves to do this work on an ongoing basis. This was important before COVID. It's doubly important now, and we know that from talking to many of you around the country that are really trying to position your post-secondary systems and institutions to make a real difference in young people and adults' lives, and frankly, to thrive in what is an increasingly complex and challenging environment. So today we're really excited to hear from 3 leaders who are making a difference in states and communities that have been hit hard by these crises. I want to introduce them to you now. First, we have Jan Yoshiwara, the Executive Director of the Washington State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, doing very impressive work out in Washington State. Second, Kenyatta Lovett, Assistant Commissioner for Workforce Services for the Tennessee Department of Labor. Tennessee is doing some terrific work that you'll hear about today. And third, Chris Lowry, Senior Vice President for Workforce Alignment at Ivy Tech Community College in the great state of Indiana. And Indiana is doing some fantastic work to try to position the post-secondary systems to be very responsive to the challenges that are being faced today. So we're thrilled to have all 3 of you with us today. And we're going to turn to you in just a moment. But before I do that, I just want to go through a few technical issues for the webinars. I know we're all getting to be experts at doing Zoom, but nevertheless, we'll be using the Q&A tab on the toolbar, and we'll be encouraging folks to put questions online that they'd like the panelists to address during the course of the webinar. And we'll be using that instead of the chat and raise your hand features that are typically used in these meetings. So go to the Q&A toolbar if you want to put a question on the table. Also encourage you to turn to gallery view if you want to be able to see all the panelists at once rather than individually. And third and finally, the webinar will be recorded, and a link will be provided to everybody that registered afterward, so you can feel free to share it with other colleagues who didn't get a chance to tune in. So next, I'd like to turn to my colleague, Kathleen Mathers, to provide a little more context on the labor market and why getting a handle on this data is so critical to positioning our systems and institutions successfully serve young people and adults. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kathleen.
Thanks, Matt. It's my pleasure to join you all this afternoon. And as Matt noted, one of the biggest challenges facing our education and training systems is understanding the profound shifts that have happened in our economy, our labor market over the last several months, so that we can point learners very thoughtfully and strategically towards good job opportunities. One way that we can do this is by studying real-time labor market information, certainly not the only way, but one strong way to approach this, to see what's happening to job demand industry by industry. And once we know which sectors and occupations offer stable or growing value, we can parse out related short-term credentials that can help learners get a job in those fields. So Cindy, if you'll take us to the next slide, I have a quick example to show you here of what this may look like. We ran some real-time labor market analyses out through the end of April, and you'll see in this graph that if you stopped your look at April as stay-at-home orders were in full force, not surprisingly, our economy was almost entirely retracted. So those blue bars that you're looking at, all aimed to the left, show you sector by sector a state of decline in terms of the job postings in those industries. If we turn to the next slide, though, you'll see we took a slightly different slice of this data and repeated those real-time analyses, this time going out through June rather than April. And this offers a different picture. You can see a different picture emerging here that shows some sectors are beginning to rebound. So notably, those that have blue bars going to the right on your screen are beginning to rebound, while others are still in a state of decline. So sector by sector, we can begin to get a picture of which pieces of our economy are beginning to come back. And just as a quick example, about a third of the way down the slide, you'll notice construction, where there's a 30% increase in job postings just in the month of June. So it's helpful information to us from a programmatic perspective as we begin to try to get our heads around where opportunity lives in an economy that has been hard struck by pandemic. At the same time, that information varies according to where you live. So it's important that we also look at real-time labor market information from a place-based perspective. While some sectors and occupations that are near us geographically may be depressed, those same sectors and occupations in other parts of the country may actually be growing. So if you take a look at this chart here, it's a little bit hard to see, but if I focus in on sort of the third row, that represents the healthcare industry. So you can see back in February and March, there were parts of our country noted in blue where demand was actually growing in healthcare. The redder you get within these graphs, the more decline you see within industries. So February and March, there was still some blue, there was still some growth in healthcare. And then that middle slide, that middle picture of our country shows you what it looked like in April, where not surprisingly, the bottom sort of fell out across all industries, but especially within healthcare. But if we continue that look, if we don't stop there and we look in May, we see some blue coming back into the map, and we see the job postings in healthcare begin to rebound in some places. And then as we get out to June, we're able to see demand increase nearly across the board nationwide. So using these signals from the labor market, we could then dive into deeper stock code analyses to understand which occupations are hiring, and really importantly, what related shorter term credentials are valued within those occupations so that we can connect it with the programs that we're putting in place to help those affected by this pandemic. During economic crises like the current one, that we have big swings in demand, looking at data month over month can also begin to reveal important trends about which sectors are declining, which are stabilizing, and which are thriving. What you see here is if we took another slice of this data and looked at it month over month over month, it begins to reveal some important trend lines. We can use that understanding as a basis for decisions we need to make about which education and training programs we want to prioritize and scale so that we can help learners earn the credentials that are needed for those good jobs. So if we take all of this together and we look at the states that have gotten a bit ahead in these challenging times, they're often moving through these 4 steps, if we could kind of try to distill it into a series of steps. Number one, that they're conducting real-time labor market analyses with frequency. They're not stopping at, a 6-month interval or even a 1-year interval. They're recognizing that there's a lot of fluctuation in market, and so they need to take frequent looks to identify those trend lines. Number two, that they're then using understanding from those analyses to identify trends regarding the sectors and the occupations that are continuing to offer opportunity in our workforce. Number three, that they are identifying shorter-term credentials that are related to those workforce opportunities that can jumpstart learners' readiness for jobs in those fields. And then fourth, and perhaps most importantly then, they're signaling those priorities to learners who are looking for upskilling and reskilling opportunities, so that there are clear markers to say, these are the opportunities in the labor market that continue to provide high value and family sustaining wages that you may want to invest in as you try to find your footing in the market. So quick snapshot there, and hopefully that provides a helpful picture of how states can and often do approach this work, but we're fortunate today because we have 3 strong leaders who are actually leading this work in their respective states. We have Kenyatta Levitt from Tennessee, Chris Lowry from Indiana, and Jan Yoshiwara from Washington. And they're going to tell us a bit about their work that they've undertaken and some concrete strategies that they've put into play. As Matt said, if you have questions throughout their presentations, we encourage you to use the Q&A tab on your toolbar. We'll do our best to monitor those questions and get responses to you, but keep in mind these slides and the webinar will be available to you afterwards so that you can access them at any point in time. But let me stop there and ask perhaps if I can ask Kenyatta to kick this off for us and tell us a bit about the work in Tennessee, specifically the Tennessee Talent Exchange. Thanks, Kenyatta.
And also the concept of short-term credentials is really centered on trying to be as agile as possible during, as you mentioned in the data before, Kathleen, a lot of shifting economic information to know how to act and how to build programs. Next slide. This is sort of an outlook of our unemployment insurance claims from March 1 until July the 11th. The 2 areas that I want to highlight are really on the right side of the pie chart. In the blue, you'll see the hospitality sector for Tennessee. When you think about either the blues and barbecue sector of Memphis and a lot of hospitality jobs there, or in the Smoky Mountains in East Tennessee and different types of tourism opportunities and tourism jobs, and especially in Nashville, Tennessee and Music City, where we have had a bustling restaurant scene, as well as other types of hospitality activities for visitors to come and patronize and spend money in our city and be a part of our economy. And you'll notice that there have been about a little bit around almost 140,000 claims filed in that sector. And I'll come back to that, but I also want to mention below that our manufacturing sector, which in Tennessee, we're heavy on the auto manufacturing side, which has been hit by COVID-19 pretty hard. With the headquarters of Volkswagen and also the headquarters of Nissan, along with a large General Motors plant. We saw some impact there, but to your point, Kathleen, a lot of that will bounce back and has bounced back. In fact, we've seen investments in new companies coming to Tennessee during this time. But back to the hospitality sector and that number that is pretty alarming for Tennessee. We knew going on in late February, middle of March, the Hospitality Industry Association predicted that of about 430,000 workers in that industry across the state, they anticipated possibly 30% would be severely damaged by the impact of COVID-19. And this sparked a conversation with that industry association, the Department of Hospitality and Tourism, the Department of Workforce and Development and Labor, along with the Department of Economic and Community Development, of what can we do knowing the impact that it will have on so many workers in the hospitality industry. Next slide. And so the conversation centered on how do we create a different type of exchange with so many workers needing jobs in different sectors that may be in demand. Could we create a new construct, a new framework? Instead of having a workforce system that works one-to-one, meaning that dislocated worker to that particular employer, could we work a one-to-many or a many-to-many, where several individuals out of one industry could actually be engaged with several employers in a different industry. And so the first concept of the Tennessee Talent Exchange was to help transition those hospitality workers into industries that had similar hours, similar wages. The first and logical choice during this time of COVID-19 was the grocery, retail, logistics, and supply chain management sectors, which offered very similar jobs. For the most part, many had transferable skills to get into those industries. And with this unprecedented demand in workforce, it made for a nice pairing between what had unfortunately happened in one industry and what was occurring in another industry. We've had anecdotal stories of individuals who were laid off from a hospitality job that morning, and through this exchange were able to land and have a job before the day ended, which is pretty impressive given how much was shut down during COVID-19 during the height of it in March and April. But the program is simply structured to help those negatively impacted workers and industries, to provide a seamless intake process for those dislocated workers, and also for those industries in demand to provide them a much larger throughput of looking at candidates to bring on, especially when demand is so urgent and it's rapidly shifting. And obviously this helps the state from this trust fund that we are all watching as states, and also to stabilize our employment rates. Next slide. I wanted to mention this as one of the challenges as the other presenters come on, and you'll see that when we launched the Tennessee Talent Exchange in the middle of March, we had unprecedented growth. I mean, a significant amount of dislocated workers signed up to be a part of it. But if you look at the inflection point around the 27th of March, which is exactly around the time when the federal government provided their response to COVID-19, because of the amount of wages from those programs, we have seen sort of a siphoning off of that interest and demand, at least through April and also through May, but that has picked up now where we're seeing even more engagement. But it's just a factor to note that these have different impacts on how employers can find workers, but also how dislocated workers respond to changes in the economy. Next slide. So in addition to that, we knew a few issues around Tennessee Talent Exchange that would inspire our larger work as a workforce system, and that being, what about those individuals that didn't have transferable skills, or there was a huge skills gap to get to that next industry? One bright spot for our work in Tennessee has been that apprenticeships have been fully embraced by employers during this time. We've doubled the number of registered apprenticeships even when there has been a shutdown for a few months. We also exceeded our goal in the number of apprentices that have signed up through this program year. And it's good to note that we're maintaining an above average outcome. So our goal is to consider more and more apprenticeship opportunities to make sure that those workers who need both work experiences, those skills, and also some way in which to earn a wage, that the apprenticeship model is one we find to be very suitable on a lot of different fronts. Next slide. The other thing that we realized too was that we were talking and prepping for this meeting about who would have thought that contact tracers would be an in-demand industry. If you had told someone you were going to take a Johns Hopkins course on Coursera in contact tracing and get a job, a year ago, people would not even have a clue what you were talking about. But now that is an industry that's very in demand, and that's a credential or a course or a skill that we can consider now to be very high wage and very credible. So what we're doing now is we've created a redesign effort in our eligible training provider list framework to rethink how we look at industry recognized credentials, how we examine third-party education providers when you think about Coursera and 180 Skills and other types of entities now that are providing virtual services, virtual education and training. And then we're also looking at our processes and standards to make sure that no local area will miss out on emerging opportunities, or that they're not agile enough to make sure that their eligible training provider list is matching up to what industry demand looks like in their region. Next slide. Some critical challenges and opportunities. While we've been able to stand up some programs really quickly and see a lot of success in job placement and employer engagement, we do know that systems integration is going to be problematic for us long term until we figure out how this is all going to play out, because there's so many new and relevant systems and technology resources available to us to connect workers and dislocated workers into job streams, that matching that with our case management system and even our grants management system is a concern. We're also looking at more of a multiple streams funding model for our agency. WIOA does a great job of funding those with the greatest barriers to employment. But when you think about how this impact is stratified, the level of skills and education across, those that have been laid off or dislocated because of COVID-19, we need different funding streams to make sure that we can address the needs of all Tennesseans. We're also concerned with the timeliness of data and in terms of job placement and even predictive data to tell us how things are shifting. We're making some headway there, but that is a concern. Another one is about, and really related to the short-term credentials, is about who will be the official custodian of the career pathways conversation. We have been great in Tennessee of having that volunteer spirit of everyone coming together and having a discussion on career pathways, but we're at that point now where we need to have an official custodian and actually set the game plan for how we're going to structure this long term. And last but not least, the training cost options have changed because so many new education providers have a different cost model because they don't have the brick and mortar that's associated with our traditional institutions. That in turn has created some opportunities and also some challenges for how we engage with employers who may not now have the funds to pay for training the way they used to, but because of new training options, we have to sort of consider what's the right framework to move forward. Next slide. And so I just wanted to mention on short-term credentials, there are a few things that we've done in response to this. And again, related to the Tennessee Talent Exchange and skills gaps, how can we quickly get individuals skilled and trained and get them into jobs quickly? The Coursera partnership has allowed us to sign up more than 2,000 individuals to take courses. We have partnered with our Skills Span and Business Leader United rep for the National Skills Coalition effort to begin matching credential earners through Coursera and IT, those Google certifications. We're going to have a couple of job fairs and sort of matchmaking opportunities later this month for employers that we know will hire immediately. And we're hoping that we can place as many that have earned credentials in these IT certifications into jobs using the frameworks that are already existing within the state. Also, there's an emerging conversation on cost models because, quite frankly, and I've argued this since the COVID-19 pandemic really struck us, is that do semesters matter as much anymore during this time or not? Because being able to start and stop at different intervals versus the traditional fall and spring semester is a little bit more advantageous for a lot of dislocated workers, given that they need to find jobs, they need to find training and education right now. We've worked with our higher education partners, and they in turn have really worked with us to find more flexible opportunities to match up to what we know the demands are for so many dislocated workers. And lastly, we're going to leverage the redesign of this eligible training provider list activity to come up with a new framework by which we can understand what are industry recognized credentials, but more importantly, what's in demand that we need to put on the radar of our local workforce boards. Next slide. And I think that's it, Kathleen. I hope I stay within my time.
You did great, Kenyatta. Thank you so much. Appreciate all the information, and I may toss a question or two your way in the chat bar there. We also have Chris Lowry from Ivy Tech Community College joining us this afternoon. Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you, please.
Great. Kathleen and Matt, first of all, thanks for hosting this event. We appreciate the work being done by ESG. It's also just a pleasure to be on the panel with folks who I bump into from time to time, and always good to follow Kenyatta and hear what's going on in Tennessee. I'm going to share with you a little bit about how Indiana has responded to the COVID crisis from a workforce and economic standpoint. And I picked up, I think Kenyatta used the word, Kathleen and Matt, on the word alignment. And I think hopefully the slides I'm going to share with you show the alignment that has taken place relative to supply and demand in the marketplace, but also within the construct of the thought leadership in Indiana and how all of this has been moving the last few months. A little bit of background. In late March, as I think we all realized what was really afoot, and especially as we saw what was happening to the economy, a group came together really informally at first, and then at the beginning of April, a group we have referred to as the state's Rapid Recovery Committee. And I think it speaks to work that's gone on for a number of years now in Indiana to align, to focus on collaboration, and really across government, business, philanthropy, education. And you can see just at a high level some of the folks who have been involved in those discussions. And initially, we as a team were meeting multiple times a week with a pretty tight agenda on how we wanted to address the concerns we were seeing evolving in the state. So in our state, we have a governor's workforce cabinet. The governor has deemed workforce so important that he has a distinct cabinet for that purpose, represented by the entities that I referenced earlier. Our Commission for Higher Education, Workforce Development, our Office of Career Connections and Talent, Strata Education, who probably many of you know is headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana, Ivy Tech Community College, and our partners at Vincennes University. And it was almost out of the gates, I think really within the first few days, that we coalesced and realized that what we really needed to be thinking about in real-time labor market, I think Matt, as you identified in one of those pages, was to think about what was going on from a supply and demand basis, and what education and training opportunities we need to be bringing forth to help reskill individuals and to help our employer partners, but also layering within there career coaching opportunities for individuals who might not have been faced with underemployment or unemployment in a number of years, and then really the sharing of information across. The first thing we did, sort of classical strategy work, was to do a situation assessment. And not surprising, and as Kathleen shared in the charts previously, a lot of really dynamic shifts occurring in the marketplace across the sectors, across specific occupations, and by geography. And I'm going to address that in a moment and how we have approached it as a state. Some of the sectors that you would expect to be hardest hit seen first, but of course expanding to others beyond that, restaurant, hospitality, and service. Clearly what we saw was a misalignment. And we made a decision early on that we were going to really dig in from a quantitative and a qualitative standpoint to look at this data. We wanted to move rapidly, and essentially what we said we wanted to develop was an ecosystem. Next slide, please. Really quickly, what we ended up developing over several weeks was something we have referred to as Rapid Recovery for a Better Future, led by Governor Eric Holcomb. You can see a quote from him when this was all announced in June. And we have utilized CARES Act funds to immediately address some of the most specific intense needs within our state. First, short-term, to grow short-term education and training. We have in Indiana the Workforce Ready Grant program, specifically targeted to both non-credit and credit-bearing credentials. The limits on those have been up to $5,500 per year for an individual. That has been increased to $10,000. And we've tucked in now some of those credentials that didn't meet a high enough standard for both the demand, wage side, previously, like CNA and CDL, because they are in rapidly rising needs. We expanded our employer training grant. I think we did that by about 17 million, the previous by about 22 million, this one by about 17 million. And this is available to employers to directly provide training and education for their employees. We really increased our outreach and promotion to a single online network as a source for Hoosiers to access. Next slide, please. In addition to that, there's been just an enormous emphasis on reaching the community. I think this is one of the emerging strategies that I think many of us have found a lot of hope in. There has been a very intentional effort to reach community-based, faith-based, and other organizations on the ground who service individuals who are often in need. And many people have started to think about it, of connecting with individuals and organizations that provide relief, and then the education and training piece of it, providing opportunity, and then allowing for that individual community transformation. Resources. I mentioned business and employers being a big partner in this. The Indiana Chamber of Commerce, I think one of the largest state chambers in the nation, 25,000 members, I believe, has been a partner in this, and they have created a rapid recovery or road to recovery website. So they've been very deep partners in this work also. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'll wrap it up with this one and slide in under my time here of 7 minutes or so. Ivy Tech then specifically has been doing things to complement this work. We've been part and parcel to all of this ongoing, and that has been to look at the market, work with our friends in those various agencies, chambers of commerce, employers, community and faith-based organizations, but then we've also tasked ourselves with doing some additional work to complement all of that. One, we announced in late May that we would be providing 10,000 free classes or training in high-wage, high-demand areas to our fellow Hoosiers. And I would first tell you, we were not able to do that alone. We went to friends who would come alongside us and help us do that. Paul Perkins at Amatrol and IDEX and others. But we said we were going to offer these in the highest demand areas that we were starting to see emerge in the labor market with these shifts in advanced manufacturing, information technology, and then more broadly in the business sector. And I believe as of this weekend, we have had about 7,500 Hoosiers take advantage of those classes, ranging from Industry 4.0, SACA certification training, to Autodesk, cybersecurity, and just a host of other information technology and business classes. We've also created a link that is being pushed out to employers, the employer resource link at Ivy Tech, and it provides a number of different assets that an employer might need while reopening the business. So everything from CDC and OSHA certified training to where to find out information about workforce ready grants, the 10,000 classes and so forth. And then lastly, this team that I described, the Rapid Recovery Team, has decided back in April that we thought it was important to do a weekly analysis of what was going on in the labor market. And so with that, we are using a variety of data ranging from IMSI data, State Department of Workforce Development data, Strata research, Strata and Gallup's research, and then at the college, we're also deploying our resources, our sector vice presidents, so each one of the economic sectors, our chancellors, and then retrieving information at the ground level, all of which goes into a weekly economic and workforce situation report that is now sent out to literally hundreds of organizations and entities across the state, ranging from government to education to businesses, so that we can have real-time data, not only at the sector level, but also very discreetly at the geographic level. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Love the emphasis on the real-time data there and connecting it to the rapid recovery response. We have with us today as well, Jan Yoshiwara from Washington State. And I wonder, Jan, if we can turn the mic over to you.
Certainly. So first of all, I too would like to thank Kathleen and Matt for organizing this webinar for us and inviting me to participate along with Chris and Kenyatta. So what I wanted to do is to focus a little bit more on what we're doing to identify high demand jobs here in Washington State and how we are positioning unemployed people to get those jobs and to get into a career pathway. So I think, it's obvious that our collective goals here are to support people who've lost their jobs to get back into the labor market in career pathway jobs and to speed economic recovery. So we've been thinking about two areas of efforts. One is how can we focus on high demand jobs with family wages? And second is how can we focus on using college credentials as a means to get low income people on a career pathway that leads to employment and wage progression over time. And so that's the who. And this is where we have to pay attention, and we are wanting to pay attention to the equity issues that were referred to at the top of this webinar, where we know that the impact of COVID and recession is disproportionate in our populations. So the first part is focusing on demand jobs with family wages. So we've got three efforts going on right now. The first is under the auspices of our state workforce board. We created a task force with that includes business, labor, K-12, the workforce development system, and the community and technical college system. And the questions that we worked on trying to answer are, what occupations will be in demand as the state moves into economic recovery? And I think as Kenyatta and Chris have both described, and Kathleen is trying to project into the future and to think about where the demand is heading and what is going to drive economic recovery, not necessarily just looking at people who have been laid off from their jobs now. We are also taking a look at where should the workforce training system focus its efforts. So from my perspective as the head of the community college system in Washington State, and I'm sure this is true across the country, is that the recession has caused huge declines in revenues for our state. And so we are staring down substantial budget cuts. We are, of course, fighting really hard to make those as small as possible, but we are staring down a reduction in state resources. So as colleges think about their program offerings and what they're going to prioritize keeping and what they're not going to be able to keep, we want to make sure that the colleges are making informed decisions about the programs that are currently, and we think in the near term for economic recovery, are going to be in the highest demand, and that they take that into consideration as a part of their planning, program and budget planning for this next academic year and the following. So we are trying to think about, in terms of focusing our efforts, which programs, which populations of people, and what types of employers do we want to focus our attention on. The third question that we have is, what incentives can we provide to help unemployed people upskill for these jobs? And so what we know from the last recession is that there was a lag time between people getting laid off and then them enrolling in training programs to upskill for the available jobs. And so what can we do to reduce that lag time so that people are getting into training programs more quickly and out into the labor market more quickly? So we took a look at a lot of data, which I won't go through, very similar to the other states. One of the things we were also able to look at was through a partnership with the Association for Washington Business, which is our state chamber, employer survey data. And they surveyed their employers every 2 weeks. They made those data available to us. And so that allowed us to get some real-time qualitative information from employers about how, what they're doing and whether they are growing or shrinking, and what their projections are for the future. So we were able to identify places where we can focus our capacity in terms of demand and emerging industries, and they're the same that Kathleen showed: healthcare, IT, business services, construction and skilled trades, manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. The second is that we concluded that we should focus our incumbent worker training resources on the occupations and industries most impacted by COVID. So hospitality, office support, retail sales. What we're trying to do is to use our incumbent worker training programs to avoid further layoffs and shrinking of businesses. And the third is that we are streamlining our policies that support unemployed people, especially lower wage workers without college credentials, to enter and complete training programs. So one of the things that we are doing, as an example, is to get waivers for people who are on unemployment insurance, who are engaged in training programs, so that they are not trying to go to school and search for work at the same time, during the time period that they're enrolled in college. The second area, and I'm going to speed up because I think I'm going to run out of time, is we've been very engaged in the Credentials of Value project. And we are using employment security data to identify both demand jobs and jobs that have a living wage. And of course, those are things like healthcare, mechanics and installers, and advanced manufacturing is what we have figured out so far. So I just want to spend a minute talking about how we're focusing on people. And so what we know from the last recession, and we've looked very carefully at the outcomes of our work from the last recession, is that the people that we have made the biggest difference for, and it actually have improved their position in terms of their earning power, both immediately and over time, are low-wage workers laid off from their jobs in declining industries who don't have college credentials. And so we are trying to think about how do we focus our efforts on those folks where there's the greatest gain. And we believe if we can do that, we will help insulate those folks from the ups and downs in the economy in the future. And so I think, we know that looking at the current unemployment insurance people, that there's a greater share of unemployed people who are young, who are low income, who are people of color, and people without college credentials. So if anything, our role with education and training and trying to get people all the way to completion of credentials is even more essential than it has been in the past. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jan. Appreciate that very much. And not surprising that across our 3 states, we've seen some synergy in terms of in-demand, high-wage opportunity. So great to have that data focus and that sort of North Star to point to. But I'd like to introduce everyone to my colleague, Rachel Vilsack from the National Skills Coalition. And Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you for a quick facilitated panel discussion.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you to our panelists. I, along with our audience, have learned a great deal on how you and your states are pointing learners to quality credentials and good jobs. Kenyatta, Chris, Jan, I'd like to shift our conversation to expand on the information that you've shared. So let's start with this question. What advantage has your strategy given you in sending clear signals about high value opportunities for learners?
I'll jump in. I think one of the key, well, there's several points, but I think one of the key elements that has come forward is that ability to reach out through community and faith-based organizations, oftentimes where, and Jan, I was listening very closely to your words, as we think about equity and we think about individuals who have really been most negatively affected economically by the COVID crisis. Often organizations, partner organizations, are serving individuals who are really in need. And I'll share one specific example with you that has occurred. One of the largest food banks in Indiana is headquartered in Indianapolis and serves about a very substantial portion of the state of Indiana, all of the food pantries. And we've been able to partner with them, both the college and the state, to push out information regarding the training and education programs that we're making available under the Rapid Recovery effort to reach people at the ground level. And of course, then backing up from that and tying it into, right, what the labor analyses are saying to us, on the ground, IMSI, the state data, and so forth. I don't believe we would have been able to do that if the various parties had not come together as they did over the past few months.
And I'll jump in too with an effort that we've been engaged in around financial aid. So our state has a very good financial aid program. It was just changed by the legislature to turn it into an entitlement program with income thresholds. So if you qualify, there's a guarantee that you will get a state need grant. So sort of very similar to the Pell Grant situation, but with higher income thresholds. So one of the things that we've been doing is to work with our state SHIO to figure out how to get more people to apply for and utilize financial aid. Because if we want people to go training programs and to be able to stay long enough to finish them, their credentials, they need income support. And so the financial aid piece is a really important part of this picture. So we have trained 350 people at the colleges who are not financial aid staff to be trainers to go out into their communities and to train volunteers in community-based organizations and faith-based organizations to help families fill out financial aid applications. And so we launched this effort actually right before COVID happened. And so in this period, we are concentrating on community-based organizations in particular that serve communities of color, because all of our data about financial aid applications, who applies and who doesn't, shows that those are the communities that have the least knowledge about how to access financial aid to be able to go to college. And so we're going to expand that this coming year with high school counselors and with faith-based organizations. And we're also we have approached labor unions who represent low-wage workers who are the most vulnerable to ups and swings in the state's economy.
Yeah, and from our perspective, I think two things. One, we've tried our best to cultivate industry conversations, and they've been a little difficult to pull off because the impact doesn't discriminate by employer. Having industry-specific conversations now has been very helpful to a more efficient solution to workforce development. And I'd say the other thing is that the ecology of education and training is starting to form, where before education and training providers and even colleges and universities thought that they could be the be-all and end-all of all the training necessary for a dislocated worker. Now they're realizing if they work together, these short-term credentials along with other strategies, you can build more viable pathways for Tennesseans to get to safety, but also to have a path forward to promise.
Thank you all. You've provided some great examples for states to consider in their outreach and support strategies. For this next question, I'd invite you to reflect on the future. How do you see your work evolving to support your state's ongoing need to connect students, including connecting high school students to post-secondary transitions and displaced workers to career pathways that require short-term credentials?
Well, I can start. In Washington State, we have a youth apprenticeship initiative called Career Connect Washington. It's based on the Swiss model of youth apprenticeships. Our governor was quite taken by that model and has sent several delegations, this is before COVID, to Switzerland to study what they're doing and how we can implement some of the principles in Washington State. So we have a significant partnership between K-12, the business community, the labor community, and community and technical colleges to create or redesign, I would say, programs that combine work-based learning and classroom instruction at both the high school level and the college level. And so you can imagine that means a whole bunch of things. That means deciding on roles, types of instruction that are offered between high schools and colleges, and making sure that there's college credit that occurs and that credit applies towards credentials in community college programs. It requires that we are focusing on the redesign effort on programs that are in the most demand by employers. And it also requires that we think about career pathways so that the credentials stack all the way to bachelor's degrees.
I'll join the conversation, Jan. And first of all, having looked at Washington State's youth apprenticeship program, it's impressive. There is a group in Indiana that has been organized now for about a year and a half under the guidance of the Richard M. Fairbanks Foundation, which I think is also a really unique approach. So a party right off to the side of thought leadership, who has been working with several of us from the community college, from Ivy Tech, Vincennes, employers, Indiana Chamber, Department of Workforce Development, and others, to develop a youth apprenticeship model here in Indiana. We've had a lot of good work going on, but a bit disparate, different models in different communities and so forth. And again, really hats off to what the state of Washington has done. We've looked at several states, and many of us have been on the trips to Switzerland, to the Institute, the Youth Apprenticeship Institute. But I think that's one of those things that we will continue to see accelerated over the next year, as that is really driven for implementation. And the other point that I would make, and I think we were all observing it, and I think maybe it was Kenyatta who was referring to this, but I think we're going to continue to see a blurring of the lines. And so I think our 10,000 classes that we are giving away, we know that we're able to do that with the partnerships that we have with private businesses who help to provide that training through us as a conduit. And we need to do that in conjunction with the Department of Workforce Development, because they can help us identify those individuals who are newly unemployed. And I guess the thing that I'm hopeful about is, having seen what we've all had to do during the COVID crisis, is that we're getting very comfortable in the blurring of those lines and supporting each other accordingly.
Yeah, I'll add from our perspective, we made our centerpiece of the work with secondary to post-secondary, but youth more importantly. We're looking at the 14 elements that are in the WIOA youth provisions. And so what we've done before COVID hit, a few months before, we created grant opportunities for local workforce development areas and forced them, and I'm using the word force, them to partner with school districts, with economic development leads, and with major employers to engage in career exploration activities with youth in school and out of school, but also to provide work-based learning opportunities where the local workforce development agency is the employer of record, to provide wages to those students who engage in the class and the work-based learning activity, which quite frankly, going back to your point, Jan, for those students low income and students of color who probably won't engage in a free work-based learning activity because they probably would work at the fast food restaurant and bring wages to themselves and to their families, they would pass on that opportunity. We wanted to make sure that wasn't an option for saying no. The other thing, and this is a larger vision that I have, and I don't know how I'm going to pull it off, Rachel, but my goal is to get at least 1 or 2 or 3 in the next year to American Job Centers located within a high school. And the theory behind at least why I want to do that is it has a lot of benefits in the 2-generation approach where parents can access those resources along with students. But when you think about our guidance counselors and the capacity or the limited capacity that they have providing career opportunities for all students, having that resource within a high school, I just want to test out to see, does that give them the capacity needed to serve all students better, but also give the resources to those students to know which pathways work better for them, along with those credentialing options.
Great, thank you. Kenyatta, Chris, Jan, another warm thank you for your participation and knowledge sharing today. I know I will look forward to see how all of your plans and goals manifest in the months and years to come. In our final minutes together, I'll turn it over to Matt for some closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I know we're nearing the hour. I too want to thank Jan, Kenyatta, and Chris for seeding some great ideas. And I say seeding because I think we probably could have gone on for another hour, just judging from the interest in the Q&A and also from the fact that I know we had to keep each of you short, but you have more to say and we have more to learn from you. And to that end, I just want everyone to know that we are planning with the National Skills Coalition and through the support of Lumina to have a series of conversations and seminars, as I mentioned earlier, over the course of the year. And we'll be sharing more information about those opportunities. Thanks to those of you who raised questions. We didn't get to all of them, but I just wanted to surface a couple things as we close that really resonated with me, that came up through the Q&A and through the speakers' comments, and just for future food for thought for all of us who are trying to make a sustained difference in this environment. One thing that really resonated with me that all of you mentioned was, and Chris, you said it last, blurring the lines of responsibility for this work. And one of the questions on the Q&A was really, where's the stewardship or responsibility for getting this done and creating these pathways and these programs? And it just seems pretty clear to me that we're at a point in time where it can't be one sector or one institution's responsibility to get this done well. It's just not feasible any longer. And where we're seeing the greatest models and the greatest impact, I'd say at ESG, and I would say our colleagues at NSC would probably agree, is places that have figured out how to break down those silos, how to get really creative about partnerships, public and private, and be nimble enough to maneuver in that space together. And I'll hope that we'll all be able to continue to foster that kind of work, whether we're national organizations, state or local or institutional, even our philanthropic partners, who I know are very keenly following this work. The second point I just wanted to make in closing is how important it is that we make it a norm right now, when I would argue it's only the exception, to be able to access and use real-time labor market information and employer engagement techniques to really have a regular feel for what's going on in the market and be responsive to that market. I think from all our work around the country, and we've talked to NSC about this, the capacity to do this is kind of scattered. It's not systematized. It takes tools, it takes resources, it takes expertise. And I would love to see us get to a point in this country where it is the norm that every system and every institution has access to the tools, the techniques, and the know-how to be ahead of the curve on this, and not to be fighting to come from behind and or guessing or having kind of a narrow lens where you really need to be able to think broadly and at all times. So my hope is we can work together collectively to figure out what that capacity needs to look like and how to make it the norm and not the exception. There are probably other big ideas, but to the point earlier, this is a continuing conversation, continuing work. So we will be sharing the slides that we used during this webinar with everyone who registered. We'll have the recording available for you and others to access. And we welcome your emails and thoughts about topics you'd like to see us delve further into as time goes on. As I said earlier, we're in this to stay. We know there's a current crisis moment that we should all be organizing around, but I think for the long term, even once we get through the COVID crisis, these very same strategies are going to be needed to sustain the great work and support systems, institutions, and individuals in our country. So thanks again to the panel. Thanks to NSC for the partnership and to Lumina for the support. And we will keep you all posted on what's up next. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks.